Check, check, check. Check, check. Check, 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 check. Check, 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 check. Ha, ha, ha. Ha, ha. Check.
Good enough. Thank you, sir. Okay, if everybody can take your seat, we are about to get started this afternoon. I hope y'all enjoyed your lunch. How was lunch? Pretty good. Okay. Thank y'all. Please give it up to our sound crew, mic crew. Yeah. Thank you very much and welcome back. I'm glad that you did enjoy the lunch. We're very pleased to be able to um, make that fajita feast available to you today. I mentioned early in the day that this event, which is in its third year, grew out of a conversation between myself and Raj Seturaju. And what I didn't say is that pretty much as soon as our ideas started rolling, a Metropolitan State student by the name of David Starks jumped in and became a part of it. He has been central to this effort the entire time. Working with him is a total joy. Here's an example of what happens when you work with David on a project. Less than 2 weeks ago, a few of us are sitting out there in the reception area that you came through, talking about, where tables were going to be and, working with space and everything. And David said, we should live stream this. And we're like, yeah, that would be a great idea. It's too bad we don't really have time to pull that together. And he said, no, 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 it's done, it's done. He pulls out his phone. So when David tells you it's done, it is done. I'm going to ask David Starks to come up and introduce our afternoon keynote, Dr. Tyner.
Thank you. I got in trouble for doing that too, but then I got it on it. So then my brother said we can do it and we can run cables and we can record every single room. So the plan was really to record every single room, and then put together. My brother has a program called IcanU, so kids always understand that they can, and he brings them into curriculum by things that interest them. So the plan was to capture everything and have them edit it down into promotional videos and B rolls and all those things, and that way you expose the kids to all of this curriculum to understand the economics behind mass incarceration at the same time. Um, that being said, when I think of mass incarceration, I think about the preventative measures to mass incarceration like a viable economic community. And so I'm going to ask we do a moment of silence um, for Kirk Washington, um, who was the epitome of work in regards to building a sustainable community. He didn't want to be on the front line, but he was on the front line. Um, so I'm going to ask for a moment of silence before I introduce Artika. Thank you. Kirk was a viable member to Metro State as well. Um, he was a student, but he taught more than he learned, I think. Um, and he modeled more than he taught. So that being said, hope I didn't dampen the mood too much. Dr. Artika Tyner, thank you for accepting our invitation. Dr. Artika Tyner is a passionate educator, author, sought-after speaker, and advocate for justice. She just recently accepted the position of Associate Vice President of Diversity and Inclusion at St. Thomas University. She trains students to serve as social engineers who create new inroads to justice and freedom. Dr. Tyner is committed to empowering others to lead within their respective spheres of influence. She is the founder and CEO of Planting People, Growing Justice Leadership Institute, which provides leadership development training and career coaching. Additionally, Dr. Tyner teaches leadership coursework on ethics, critical reflection, and organizational development. Her research focuses on diversity, inclusion, community development, and civil rights. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Tyner. So I guess you got either or.
Thank you, and good afternoon. I'm excited to be here with you today because this is an opportunity for us not just to talk about mass incarceration, but have an opportunity to talk about how we can respond and truly make an impact. So with that, let's get started. The presentation will be responding to mass incarceration, 8 strategies for leading change. Now, please know that 8 strategies isn't all-inclusive, but I only had a limited amount of time, so I think this will be a good starting place for us. But I hope that this is a beginning of a conversation that we will continue to have, and also the beginning of taking strategic action. So, you've had the opportunity then throughout the day, through the breakout sessions, the morning keynote, and some of the other panels, to get a sense of what is mass incarceration. But I thought in order to set the context, I'll give just a brief overview. The first one is related to what's happened. What's going on? What are we seeing? What are the trends? Now, these are national trends. It gives us a sense of what Michelle Alexander talked about as this new Jim Crow. We're seeing a peak of going from 350,000 people incarcerated to over 2 million people today. But more importantly, asking the question, you see also the U.S. as an industrialized nation, having 5% of the world's population, but 5% or 25% of the world's prison population, an opportunity to ask some questions as well. And I use that question again of what's going on, in the words of Marvin Gaye, to peel back the layers, not just to look at this data any longer, but get a sense of righteous indignation in your belly. If you don't have it yet, I hope you will have it by the conclusion of my remarks. So, with that, let's take a look closer, because we know, based upon Michelle Alexander's work, one of the things that we needed to think about, that this just didn't happen. This wasn't happenstance. That one of the greatest contributing factors was the war on drugs and seeing nonviolent offenders entering into the prison gates. But also, we have to take an opportunity to reframe the message, because it's easy to say it's someone else's problem, or there's a super predator, or this great criminal, this boogeyman in the closet. But truly what we're talking about today, and I wanted to start with this slide, because even Sesame Street understood this issue. It's like even the children will lead us in understanding this issue. We have Brother Alex on the side there. I wanted you to have the image. Sesame Street said we had to talk about mass incarceration. So how are we not talking about it in our church houses, our schoolhouses, and across the nation and across the world as a human rights issue? And you can see here, you can read the statistics, that 62% of women who are incarcerated are mothers, 51% of men who are incarcerated are fathers, and 2.7 million children have an incarcerated parent. So we can see that Mass incarceration has a direct impact on broken families, leading to also broken communities. Next, I'd like for us to take a look at something very specific, because sometimes, once again, we like to talk about mass incarceration as this broad thing. But let me bring it closer. I like to refine the lens. You also see here, based upon the statistics listed, and I'm comparing what Michelle Alexander talked about in the new Jim Crow, of Jim Crow from 1876 to the mid-1960s. You see a racial caste system emerging, and you also see that thing called convict leasing. Now, does anyone here in the audience know convict leasing? What does it connect to as far as amendments in the Constitution? Does anyone know? Is there any connection there? 13th Amendment. You're doing better than some of my law students. They used to look at me puzzled. It's like the 13th Amendment. What is the 13th Amendment? How does it relate to convict leasing? You can't hear very well back there. I'll switch microphones. I'm adaptable, don't worry. Hold on, I want to make sure everybody hears me, so let's take a quick pause. In the back, mic check 1 2 1 2. Can you hear me? All right, we're good. All right, because I want to make sure you don't miss anything, because guess what? I'm enlisting you as ambassadors in the Justice League. We're going to go out and share this information. So can you hear me in the back? All right, good. So the 13th Amendment, what do you see about it? Words have power. What do you know? There's an exception there unless that looks at if someone's duly convicted of a crime. So we see that entry point. But then some folks say, well, here's the myth as they talk about it related to race. Well, black folks, people of color more generally, are more likely to commit a crime. Where did we learn that? Fox News, okay. Where did we hear that? And NBC. So we're saying, what I'm hearing here is it's a message that's been given to us. But one of the things that we have to look at, what do you do with the message? You reframe it, you challenge it, and you dispel the myths. So truly, when we see this Jim Crow emerging, it was more than just 2 words. It was a lifestyle. But more importantly, it was a culture that was reinforced by what? Laws and policies. So when we look specifically at Jim Crow, when we look specifically at what happened after the Civil War, what do we see? We see the black codes emerging. And what did they really mean? That people were entering into, not the prison gates formally, but in a prison system based upon things like talking too loud. Based upon things like congregating and being unemployed. Go figure, you were just freed from slavery. Where's your job? So some of these things we have to start questioning and peeling back the layers. But if we go to the other side and take a look at the other side of the slides and looking at today and what is called as a new Jim Crow, we see that the U.S. has a problem, a reality as it relates to race. And when we look at it specifically, the U.S. imprisons a larger percentage of its black population than South Africa during the heart of apartheid. But the other thing that you see is also that the U.S. has incarcerated more African American males than who were enslaved during the 1800s. So do we see a connection here related to race? I'll leave you to answer that question throughout the rest of the day as well. But specifically, when we look at this breakdown, and this is one of the reports from the Sentencing Project, you can see it yourself, but more generally, you see the disparities up close and personal. So for men, you can look at the first category, 1 in 3. Black men in their lifetime have a likelihood of being in prison, and also Latino men, 1 in 6, and you see the disparities even far greater for women as well. So why do I start here? Because before you can start a conversation, you need to frame it. So how many of you we have some common ground, some common language related to mass incarceration? Please raise your hand. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Please realize this will also be interactive, so this won't be the first time you raise your hand, okay? Because I'm fighting after lunch snooze, all right? So let's jump in, okay? I wanted to set our foundation, but let's start to build. The first slide that I'd like to build with here is a call to leadership. Because in order for us to look at any of these strategies, we have to know that we have to take action. Because I've been to too many conferences, get new knowledge, new information, people tweet it, put it on Facebook, but what will you do with it is a different question. So for me specifically, I want to tell you a little bit about my story and how I became passionate about these issues. Now I have here an image of Miss Freedom Fighter Esquire, and that was basically my childhood dream with a love for superheroes and a love and a passion for making an impact. I said, I want to be Wonder Woman with a law degree and an afro. So there you go. You can see me now. See a little more clearly of who I am. But why? What was that all about? So I traveled all over the nation and the world over the past year of asking this question of what is in your hands to make a difference in the world. And when I ask that, sometimes I get a puzzled look, sometimes I get blank stares, and sometimes I get, I don't know. Or one gentleman, he was very candid. He's like, what's your angle? It's like, my angle is justice and freedom. What's yours? So when I looked at it specifically, what does it mean? Are we missing opportunities to make an impact with your level of influence? Whether you're a student, whether you're a political leader, whether you're a community member, wherever you are, there is a call to leadership for you. But I want to get specific on how it relates to mass incarceration and myself. So when I looked at it, I felt compelled to take action. Because over time, what happened to me and from growing up was that injustice had become my reality. So I saw all that data and statistics related to mass incarceration truly coming alive. There was no distance. So the other thing I'm going to challenge you throughout my speech as well is get rid of distance. Dr. King talked about what happens with compassion when it's no longer at a proxy, no longer at a distance, but compassion is a part of our daily lives, our daily mission. So when I look at it specifically related to my life, when I said injustice had become a reality and a lived reality for me, I was a child witness to the war on drugs. So what did I see? That our moms, our dads, our brothers, sisters, aunts, and uncles entered into the prison gates. And most people leave the story there. But truly, if you know anything about data related to the criminal justice system, folks are coming back home. 95% of people are coming back home, returning back to the same communities that they left with the same problems. But all of a sudden, they have a heightened challenge. What is it? They have that permanent scarlet letter that reads what? F for felon. It meant that they were locked up and locked out of opportunities in the community. They were locked out of opportunities like access to the ballot box, locked out of opportunities like common basic things, access to jobs, access to housing, access to education. So at that point, I realized that our communities were broken. But I wasn't done yet because I said, okay, there's hope. There's something else that I can do. I can become an educator, make an impact in the classroom. So I said my first goal will be I'll become a high school English teacher. So I was happy. I love my English teacher. Mrs. Haug, she was like the best things to slice bread. I'm like, she is. That love of literature, she introduced me to James Baldwin, W.E.B. Du Bois. I was like, perfect. But truly the reality had become, by the time I made it into the classroom, there was far too many students that were struggling with one basic thing, the ability to read. So I'm in a kindergarten classroom, like, no one here can barely recognize letters. Definitely can't get to hooked on phonics. What are we doing? And we know the words of Malcolm X, that education is a passport for the future. But yet we allow too many young people to have that passport permanently revoked. And I know it's easy. Most educators that I talk to say that's a parent's problem, that's a child's problem, but it's a community's problem. So I realized that our children were also broken. So I was at a crossroads. At the intersection of race and poverty, our communities were broken, so I made a choice. And I decided to go to law school because I know the law is a language of power. So I said, let's become well-versed in my second language here. I became multilingual all of a sudden. And that's truly when Miss Freedom Fighter Esquire stepped on the scene. And that's truly when I decided to roll up my sleeves and really make an impact. But specifically, when I look at it related to leadership, it's an opportunity for us to redefine leadership. Because sometimes we say it's about a position or a title or somebody else in charge. But with asking that question of what's in your hands to make a difference in the world, I'm talking to each of you to pick up the mantle of leadership and make an impact. And when I talk about leadership specifically, I'm talking about influence. That we all have a measure of influence. What will you do with it? I met a young woman last week when I was lecturing at Howard Law School. She had a level of influence I knew nothing about, this thing called Snapchat. I'm like, hundreds of people just watched this 30-second video 30 seconds after you posted it. What is this? She was like, Dr. Tyner, you're behind the times. So let me help you out here. So I have a Snapchat now. I haven't posted anything, so don't rush and look. But I had to tell her, she said, okay, Dr. Tyner, you can do the public speaking, you can write the books, you can do all these things, but I got you covered on social media. I was like, that's a blessing. Because she had a level of influence through social media that I did not have. So I give that as just one example, but what's in your hands? What type of influence do you have? And that truly led me on the journey of developing Planting People, Growing Justice as a community empowerment model. In the sense of engage people making a difference. Engage people. What can they do? Radically change the world. So I hope you're ready. So as I look at go from the first step of leadership framing our entire conversation, I want to look at strategy number 2, create jobs in poverty. Okay, strategy number 2, pause here. Am I missing anything in the title of that slide? Create jobs in poverty. I didn't talk about what type of jobs, I didn't talk about specifics, but is there anything that I'm missing? Thank you. Whoever said it, let's give them a round of applause. Let's be practical here. My students always used to come after me. They're like, create jobs, Dr. Tyner. I was like, okay, so a minimum wage job. How much is minimum wage right now? $9. Okay, when I first started working, it was $4.25, so we're making some progress. But at $4.25, $9, is that an exit point out of poverty? No. So I encourage you to add an adjective there when we're talking about creating jobs. Create livable wage jobs. And then the question then becomes, Dr. Tyner, can we do that? Anytime you have a will, you can do anything. So do we have the will and the moral courage to do it is a different question. So when we look at it specifically, and I had to go back, I had just this awakening moment. I'm just returning also from Tennessee. I did a civil rights bus tour. And there's a woman by the name of Miss Jackie that sits in front of the National Civil Rights Museum and tells her story. And she talks about how the story of Dr. King is incomplete because we still need to work on poverty. Still need to have the Poor People's Campaign come alive in cities all across the nation. But she said one thing that just really shook me. It's like, I have to go back home and really think about this. She said, poverty is violence. It's like, I never looked at it that way. Because the myth and the narrative that I always had is, if you're in poverty, it's your own fault. You didn't work hard enough. You didn't get the right educational tools. You didn't pull up your bootstraps and lace them up properly. Am I the only one that ever heard some of those messages? So as I started to look at it and think about it, I was like, Miss Jackie, those words linger with me for over a week. Poverty is violence. So I wanted to look at it a little bit closer. I even found that our dear friend Aristotle was talking about this thing called poverty. Can you believe it? What did he say about poverty? Poverty is the parent to revolution and crime. Poverty is the parent to revolution and crime. And I had to think about that, because that's a totally different narrative on how we look at mass incarceration as it relates to jobs, as it relates to housing, as it relates to opportunities. That we know the source, but what will we do with it? How will we address poverty? And just a little sidebar. I'm an educator, so you know I have to make sure I give a little sidebar. Make sure that you take an opportunity to read Dr. King's final book, Where Do We Go From Here, Chaos or Community? It's prophetic. It talks about the same issues that we grapple with today. The triple threats that he talked about, which were what? Racism, poverty, and war. And you don't have to look too far to see that those same triple threats are alive and well today. But as you know, Dr. King's final campaign would have been the Poor People's Campaign. Instead of just doing a sit-in, he said that we would do a live-in on the nation's capital, which happened in May 1968. Thousands of people went to the nation's capital to say, this is the face of poverty. Not a black face, not a white face, but a face of poverty in a land of plenty, to raise some questions. And with doing that, we saw a lot of policy reform, but the work is still not finished. But let's look at it specifically. Let's get us back to Minnesota. You have your homework. So book purchase number 1 is which one? Okay, we're learning quickly. I like it. All right. So our region ranks number blank out of 25 largest U.S. metros, cities, in the white, non-Hispanic, of color gap in proportion to working. What are you saying? Sometimes the data sounds a little riddled. The unemployment gap. We rank number 1. We're pretty close. We're at the bottom. We're number 23 out of 25. So we're close to our number 1 rank. But the question is why? And the easy answer is, well, we don't have enough jobs. We need a more educated class of students to compete in the globalized economy. The excuse is the list will go from here to the back door. But truly the reality is, do we have the moral will once again to create? So, for prevention, go figure, create opportunities for upward mobility. Wouldn't that be a great crime prevention method? Oh, I have to start with it again for intervention. Create opportunities for upward mobility. And for a good measure, I'll say it the third time. Create opportunities for upward mobility. Secondly, develop post-release employment opportunities. What's happening? I can't tell you how many men and women that I met that said, well, I'm preparing for the transition to come back home. I have new skills. But where are the jobs? And those livable wage jobs, to be specific. And then also, what do you see happening in other states? Changes in policies by providing incentives for employers to hire folks as they're returning back home. So what will we do? How will we reform policies? But more importantly, let's put it in the context of the economy, our local economy. It's missed revenue. If everyone's not engaged in the workforce and have opportunities to what? Purchasing, buying power? This is just the business case. I haven't even gotten to the moral case yet. In the state of Minnesota, by not having full participation of everyone in our local economy, the Itasca Project has shown us that we're losing annually roughly about $500 million a year in state and local tax revenue. So things that make you go, how do we ask the questions, the key questions? I also have this here as a sense of the history and making a connection just for a moment. So March for Jobs and Freedom. So I'll read this quote and I want you to tell me who stated this. It said, a community is democratic only when the humblest and weakest person can enjoy the highest civil, economic, and social rights that the biggest and most powerful possess. Whose words are these? Does anyone know? Any ideas? George Washington? Okay, no, that's all right. It could be a little interactive. Try again, though. See, I'm polite. Hubert Humphrey sounds a little bit like Hubert Humphrey, kind of in the same vein. Anyone else? We'll give a third try. Angela Davis sounds a little bit like that theme, too. Try on. Okay, I'll save us because we'll be trying for a while, I can see. So, I'll throw you a lifeline here. A. Philip Randolph. A. Philip Randolph. Most of us don't know his name, but the government knew his name. At one point, the president said what? That he was the most dangerous Negro in America. They're like, watch out for this brother. And why did they say that? Because he realized that at the root of many of the social problems that we face were a challenge related to economic justice. Isn't that a challenge related to education, access to health care, access to jobs? Yes. But let me dispel one other myth, because then when I go down this lane, people say, well, that's not capitalism. But I challenge you to go through a new read of our dear friend, Adam Smith. And one of the things that he talked about, it wasn't just a supply and demand, a need, and you respond to it with a business interest. He also talked about two words, universal opulence. And what did he mean by that? In simplest terms, he meant that the economy also has to function for a moral right. So if we ask those questions of, is the economy also focused on a moral right and the well-being of the community, I'll leave you to answer that. But A. Philip Randolph said, we're going to move you a bit closer. And his leadership style was by getting people organized. So he was behind the scenes organizing what we call today the 1963 March on Washington. So homework for you, please look up A. Philip Randolph and learn more about his course and his life history. But more importantly, because I get some students to say, I don't read anymore, Dr. Tyner. I was like, that is interesting. But if you're not in the reading mood, please, you can check out a video about his life called 10,000 Black Men Named George. What was that all about? Sleeping car porters, unions getting organized and recognizing labor rights are human rights as well. So specifically, that takes me into the next vein. Step number 3 that we have to think about then. Educational opportunities. You have the data here. You can take a look. You can see what some call the achievement gap. But really, is it an achievement gap? Because that really states a value about expectations. I would say it's more of an access gap. Who has access to opportunities? What's their foundation? Go back to that kindergarten classroom. I didn't need the foundation of my phonics. My mom already taught me my basic phonics and reading when I came into the classroom. But the easy answer is, what about the parents? What about us? So I had to tell some folks. I was like, okay, every time I went to the legislature, I would anticipate that question. What about the parents? Whatever topic it was, what about the parents? And then finally, I must admit, my personality came out. It was like, you are the parent. The last time I checked, if you're an adult and there's a child near you, you are the parent. Child, and I gave this metaphor. It's on record. You can find it. I said, well, child's running across the street. Car emerging. Child will get hit. Do you sit there and say, where is the parent? It's like, I hope the parent comes soon. If the parent doesn't come, maybe I'll give CPR. Come on. We can do better than that. And more importantly, we also have to realize for each of us, our success is not just by one person. It's that village approach of who made an impact in your life as well. So when we look at this specifically, we have opportunities to create change, and we know how to do it. Don't take that excuse any longer. Literacy, we have proven literacy models. Mathematics, science, we have proven models. But will we use them, and will we invest in all children equally? That's a totally different question. Next up, definitely related to this education piece, is disrupting the school-to-prison pipeline. And let me make this come alive for you as well. Because once again, the myth is children of color tend to act out more in school. Children of color deserve harsher punishment because of their behavior. Children of color are in the schools with gang violence, guns, drugs, fighting all day long. Those are the myths, but guess what the Department of Justice was able to find for us through the Civil Rights Department? That the reality was that none of those things were true. In fact, more young people enter into the juvenile justice system as referrals from schools specifically for what? Typically the first thing is truancy. So that one I'm still riddled on. So I didn't go to school, and then I'm not going to go to school and then end up in juvenile detention. You can figure that one out for me. Shows we have some other issues to deal with. Peel back the layers. And the other one is in more subjective categories, like talking out and misbehaving. So I can tell you now I would have been in the school to prison pipeline. Thank goodness it didn't exist when I was a child, because talking too much, you can see with this mic in front of me, was a daily reality. Okay? But one of my teachers, Dr. Grays, he got pretty wise. He said, oh, perfect, you love to talk, and you know the academic piece. He's like, I have a free TA. So I'm challenging you educators out there to get a little creative. He kept me occupied with doing what? Teaching, empowering other students. So in that way, the problem child, what else is going on? What are the other challenges? How many young people have I talked to that are acting out in school? I was like, what's going on? The two most common themes that I hear, they're sleepy and they're hungry. What? 3 out of 5 children go to school hungry. How can you learn if you're hungry? How can you learn if you're tired? So how do we get back to the basics? Just some other questions to think about. But going specifically back to the school to prison pipeline, I want to give you some truths about it. The first one is nearly 3.3 million children are suspended and referred out of the classroom annually in America. The second fact that you must know related to that, a single suspension does what? Doubles the odds of dropping out. And to put it in context, you're like 3.3 million children, what does that mean? That's enough children to fill every seat in every NFL stadium across the nation. That's a lot of children. And just a common sense approach. Because sometimes my grandma warned me, she was like, don't get all those degrees and just lose common sense, because common sense isn't too common. I was like, whoa, I can't even follow that riddle. It's like, I better study that one tonight. Common sense, if you're not in a classroom, there's a missed opportunity to learn. So we just have to talk about this in a practical way. So when we look at this specifically, the other thing that I want to talk about that is oftentimes ignored as we look at responding to the criminal justice system is implicit bias. We don't talk about it. And even when we do, we don't go far enough. So usually implicit bias looks a little something like this. I'll use myself because people start getting uptight, like, what will she say? I'll use myself. The easy way where most Minnesotans do it, our Minnesota nice thing, we'll say it's something like, do I want those oatmeal raisin cookies that my brother was offering me? I was like, no, I don't like raisins, right? But if we go the next step, if he came with that platter with craisins and white chocolate in there, I would have took all his cookies. We say, oh, that's implicit bias, because she just doesn't like raisins, so she didn't choose those cookies. Or I have one colleague that says, oh, it's like the difference between choosing white bread or wheat bread or rye. It's like, no. Pause, time out here. Get back to common sense. Anytime our unconscious mind is influenced by something, what does it do? It impacts our action. So we know the truth to be told. Dispel a myth once again that implicit bias doesn't exist in our legal system. Look at the 1993 report from the Supreme Court Racial Bias Task Force. Homework assignment number 3. Take a look, even if you read the executive summary. It's one page, but this is one of the highlights that I just wanted to share with you. If you take a quick look, 6% of the state's population are people of color, but they comprise 45% of the prison population. What's the easy answer? Myth again. People of color are more likely to commit crime, and we end the analysis there. But when we started to peel back the layers related to implicit bias, what did we find? A little bit of truth. A little bit of truth to see that from the beginning to end, when you have an encounter with law enforcement all the way to the point of sentencing, what do you see? Individual actors who make a decision that maybe that unconscious bias is rising up again. Maybe we see then that young people in the juvenile justice system, 2 similarly situated young people, same crime, just different hue, different outcome. We have to answer to that. And then we see it in adult criminal justice system as well. So what am I saying here? First, now I made one man very angry. I was like, he's going to stomp out of my presentation. That's okay, because sometimes getting angry leads to growth too. But my colleagues all try to be politically correct. They just say, you make people uncomfortable. It's like, okay, whichever you choose, I own it, as long as you're thinking and you're taking action. And his was angry. I said, that's okay. Let me just sit down here. When you calm down, we can figure out whether or not we finish this presentation. Because I barely got past hello and started to talk about implicit bias. He raised his hand and said, you're calling me racially biased. I'm like, well, if you said that this quickly, you're calling yourself something. Might be a little truth you're saying about yourself. Because then the reality all of a sudden became that he made it seem like implicit bias didn't exist. And it was just about race. But I said, let's make it plain. Race is a factor as it relates to the criminal justice system. But race, we also have to step back and say, what is race? So I used to own it. I used to say, okay, well, I'm African American, I'm a minority, and this is. I had a little commercial because I was being taught that. Then all of a sudden, I was just like, what does that all mean? So race as a social construction. How do we look at that? Race is a political tool. Race rooted in white supremacy. There's ideology there. It's not neutral. Now, that's not to say I don't have a culture or ethnicity, okay? Let's just be clear. And I own that too. But the reality is when you talk about race and you say I'm African American and I'm a minority, you just frame something up. In the education world, you typically are framed up that I'm inadequate. You typically framed up some of the messages that I received from people, will you pass the bar on the first try? Oh my goodness, can you read and write? Can you make it through that LSAT? And then when I'm in front of the mic, this is the one that I love. People come out of nowhere. You're so articulate. I was like, I sure hope so. $150,000 later. Yeah, still paying those student loans, so if you want to give a donation. But $150,000 later, being in the church pulpit, Sunday school, vacation Bible school, I better be articulate. But the reality was it wasn't a compliment. It was just that it defies someone's myth. And that's when I challenged it. Because one of my colleagues said, are you getting angry again? I was like, no, I'm not angry. And it usually goes something like this. Don't be angry and lower your voice. Like, I don't even have the strength to raise my voice. If you heard me raise my voice, you know it. It's never happened. So when I think about this, once again, we say that implicit bias is just this thing over here, but it's also related to our expectations. I had a woman, I wasn't as suited and booted as I am today. I was walking to the courthouse, needed to drop something off, just in sweats, and I didn't have any cash. I was going to give her $1 for 25 cents. You know what she did? She clutched her purse like, you people always want something. Oh, wow, I said the same thing. But yet we say implicit bias doesn't exist and doesn't impact our actions. So take a look at your next homework assignment. Is to take a look at the 1993 report. And for my students, I want you to go a step further. I want you to look at the data and see how much has changed. And I can give you a precursor, not much. And in most categories, things have gotten worse. So how will we reframe this message? The next thing, take action. Take action. Of course, I talked about taking action to address implicit bias, knowing and identifying that it exists and challenging it when you see it. But take action related to policy reform. Take action, lift your voice. So the first thing that I had here, end prison gerrymandering. What is that all about? Most people just say, oh, that's about voting, who has access to voting. No, that's about resources. That's about the economy. In Minnesota, it's a message that we don't like to talk about because what does it really mean? We measure federal aid by what? We measure federal aid and distribution by what? Population, U.S. Census report. And it didn't dawn on me until I was filling it out myself. So my mom, my brother, and I was like, okay, we got to do this family thing. Let's fill out all this stuff, right? We're doing paperwork. I said, okay. But then I paused like midstream, and they're like, hurry up so we can finish this. But I was like, pause, time out. So you mean to tell me if my brother was in prison, I don't count him on my U.S. Census? They're like, no. I was like, what do you mean, no? But hold on, time out again. Isn't it true that most families who have an incarcerated loved one send in money? And isn't it true if we connect the dots now, 95% of people are coming back home, they're coming back to the communities they left with less resources than when they started, because all of a sudden my resources went to Shakopee, all of a sudden my resources went to Lino Lakes, Faribault, St. Cloud, and it didn't come back to Rondo. So raise your voice, students. Get involved. Make an impact. There's different ways to make an impact, and this is one. Secondly, promote restore the vote. 47,000 Minnesotans can't vote. Why? They're in our community paying taxes, everything else, but they're on paper, in the vernacular. They're on paper, on probation or parole. But let's look at this specifically. What does that mean? Once again, you don't have a voice to shape your own destiny. You don't have a voice to impact the policies around you. Stand up. And address collateral consequences, those hidden consequences. And actually, I'm going to go to my next slide here. But sometimes we don't talk about it specifically. I watched too many times when I was a judicial intern. People would plead out, or they would say, I understand what's going on, but let me give you a little fact here. Related to your legal case and an issue, an attorney only has the duty to give you a warning about collateral consequences related to what? Immigration. Well, hold on. Pause there, sister. What do you mean just immigration? What if my job requires me to have a professional license and I just pled out on something? Is there a problem there? Can I keep my job? No. How many times do I see people do that? One guy was like, ooh, but I wasn't his legal counsel. But I'm like, get your PD's attention. No. It can't work that way. We need policies related to collateral sanctions or consequences. There are over 22 categories written into Minnesota statutes. But more importantly, we get there, but we forget one other piece, another layer, administrative law. Department of Human Services says things like, you have a felony? Maybe even if you're a young person. Sometimes we think when you're 18, we tell the kids, ooh, poof, be gone. Your record disappears. How long can your record be available for a young person? Till what age? It's not 18. I'm giving you a hint here based upon the BCA's record keeping. 25, 28, go higher. Depending on what it is on the administrative side, it could be forever. There are permanent bans, but it's typically 28. So when we look at this then, for many people, it's a lifetime of that scarlet letter, once again, that I talked about, a felon. From everything, being able to work with vulnerable populations, isn't that a contradiction? Because the fastest growth area is in what profession? Healthcare. So being excluded from what? The economy again. So take a look at this. Lift your voice related to collateral consequences as well. But as we move into our final stretch, I want to give you the last 2 steps because I hope there's something here for everybody. If you're not working on education, work on the U.S. Census piece. If you're not working on that, work on creating some jobs. If you're not working on any of them, what can you do? Take this message to the church house, the school's house, and the people's house, the legislature as well, to raise your voice. But more importantly, what we really need to do is take a comprehensive approach. I think for far too long we said mass incarceration is this thing over here that impacts some people. But the reality is it impacts all of us. Why? Because if we look at just the economic piece, let me give you a little food for thought related to Minnesota. I'm going to bring it home. Because on the average for states, they tend to spend 2 times more on incarceration than public education. What does it look like in Minnesota? It's nearly 4 times more. We spend nearly $41,000 to incarcerate, and typically on the average, we're spending roughly about $10,000 per public school student. So it's also a question related to our investment. So when we look at a comprehensive approach, I know I have Father Gregory Boyle here, and he's known for that mantra of nothing stops a bullet like a job. But most recently, an article that featured him talked about something else, that this isn't a gang violence issue. This isn't an opportunity gap issue or achievement gap issue. Let's bring it to its core. It's about a broken village. It's about broken relationships. And when he talked about it specifically, it's about creating a kinship network to surround each of us. So when we think about this, so we move from saying it's this other thing that the sociologists have to worry about to this side over here and saying it's a community public health issue that impacts everyone. So when we look at this specifically, I had to draw upon, I told you about returning from my civil rights bus tour, Dr. King a little bit. As I was listening to his speech again, even as I was driving over, I've been to the mountaintop. I've been to the mountaintop. His final speech on April 3rd, 1968, before his life was cut short. And what did he talk about in I've been to the mountaintop? He used a metaphor of the Good Samaritan. How many of you are familiar with that story? Because then you'll help me streamline. Got a few hands, vast majority. But the Good Samaritan, you hear this story and I'll bring it to present day times. Somebody stuck on the road, on a dangerous road. Maybe it was dark, maybe it's around a corner, we don't know. We don't like to go to unusual places, right? And there are 3 people that pass by. The first one just, might have to skip to the other side of the road. And I don't want to make you raise your hand on how many times you see something, you're like, let me just keep moving. The other person kind of does the same thing, like, isn't that a shame? Isn't this mass incarceration thing too much of a shame? But then the third person does what Dr. King said we all need to do. Stop going and saying that's somebody else's problem. Change our whole message that I'm my brother's keeper and I'm my sister's keeper. And when you change that message, he said all of a sudden you're going from compassion being over here at arm's length to bringing proximity a bit closer, to looking at our shared humanity and our common destiny. So he gives them the question of, and I've been to the mountaintop, instead of just saying, if I help this man, what will happen to me? Maybe I'll lose some time, maybe it'll be uncomfortable, maybe I don't know what to say. To a different question of if I don't help my brother or my sister, what will happen to them? What will be their destiny? What will be their future? And I think that's a question set before us today, that mass incarceration isn't just this thing on the side of the road, but it's a reality of something that's been created, been institutionalized in America, in fact, if we call a spade a spade. But what will we do to go closer? To say, how about this? How about I start to create some jobs? How about I give somebody a second chance? And don't think you can't do something, because truly the challenge is for most people, you choose not to do anything. So when we look at this specifically then, and asking those questions, he's saying it's not just a criminal justice issue, it's a societal problem, which takes me to the next slide. And this one's specifically related to restorative justice, because I think that could give us some new lenses, some new dimensions related to how we look at criminal justice. But I think it also brings us back to the basics, some core values. What are the values of community? Justice. And what does justice look like? Dr. King said justice is really love and calculation. Justice is really love and calculation. What would that really look like if you love somebody in a different way? And more importantly, what if you love them like you loved yourself? Your impact and how you choose to make a difference may be different. What are some of the other values? Freedom, liberty. I talked about the power of the vote, a democracy, as we say it. But how do we have a democracy without full participation? And here's the myth and the easy answer. It's where my law students used to get uptight. They'll say, that's the law, it's black and white, it's how it's written. But let me tell you a little something that sometimes we miss on our history lessons related to the law. Even our framers said something, whether it was Thomas Jefferson, who gave remarks such as what? That every generation will create a revolution. Every generation will do what? A new design. Because we have new pressing issues. What will be our design? What will people say about this chapter of history? That we failed on mass incarceration? That we had more diversity than we ever expected, but we haven't embraced it? What will they say? That certain people thrived and they became millionaires and billionaires, but the wealth gap got bigger? What will they say about our chapter of history? Now that's in the abstract, but what will they say about you? What will be your story? Can you rewrite a history chapter within your own sphere of influence? That's really that leadership question. But I want to conclude with the quote here from Dr. King. It says, in a real sense, all life is interrelated. All men are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. I can never be what I ought to be until you are what you ought to be. And you can never be what you ought to be until I am what I ought to be. This is the interrelated structure of reality. So when I think about that interrelated structure, I think that's a Miss Freedom Fighter Esquire moment. Because what my students taught me as we fought against the high cost of prison phone calls, as we fought to support, restore the vote, as we fought to end the racial jobs gap, that we have power in our hands. When we ask the question of what is in your hands to make a difference in the world, I hope you look at your hands in a different way and realize that you have the type of transformative power to make liberty and justice a lived reality for all. But now you know, I'm enlisting you into the Justice League, but no good superhero can be without a theme song, right? So let me tell you about my theme song for a moment. Inspired by Ella Baker, Sweet Honey and the Rock sings it best. Ella's song. And what are the words? What are they all about? They're about a woman named Ella Baker who was referred to as Fundi. Fundi, what did they mean by that? A Swahili word of her being a teacher, of her being an ambassador for justice and passing it along for generations to come. But the words of the song, Ella's song, I think are the words that we need today. But before I give you the words, it's also a sense of what Dr. King talked about, that the most tragic thing that we can do is sleep during a revolution. And some of us have hit snooze too long. When 2 million of our brothers and sisters are incarcerated, when opportunities and doors are closed unnecessarily, we've hit snooze too long. So the call to action that we find in Ella's song is, we who believe in freedom cannot rest. We who believe in freedom cannot rest until it comes. Are you resting, my friends? Or will you put your hand to the plow and say that I will make a difference? I'll stand for justice and I'll make freedom a lived reality. Thank you.
No, you're not done yet. You do it again. It's time.
Cannot rest. We who believe in freedom cannot rest until it comes, until the killing of black men, black mother sons, is as important as the killing of white men, white mother sons. We who believe in freedom cannot rest. We who believe in freedom cannot rest until it comes.
You brought it home, Dr. Tyner said. This is what you're taking to your breakouts with you, right? This is the afternoon breakout. I told you this morning, this is where the juice is. This is where you commit. This is where you decide. This is where you say, I'm going to take what's in my hands and make a difference. Go.
Those of you who are going to the Civil Rights Restoration, please meet in room 152 in St. John's Hall. Right? St. John's Hall, 152. Right? Civil Rights. Yeah. Oh, please go back to the same room that you were in this morning. This is about you taking action. So go back to the same room. Thank you all.